I rise today to speak about my amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, an amendment known as the Bipartisan Military Justice Improvement Act. I want to start by thanking my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their strong and unwavering leadership on behalf of our brave men and women in uniform. I could not be more proud of the bipartisan work that has been done to do the right thing. I want to thank Senator Reid, Senator Booker, Senator Heller, our three most recent supporters of our bill. I want to thank them for their extraordinary leadership and determination to end the scourge of sexual violence in the military. I also want to thank my colleague and friend from Missouri for her unwavering commitment to helping victims of sexual assault. Although we disagree on my amendment, I want to remind all our colleagues that the defense authorization has been made stronger in innumerable ways by Senator McCaskill's work, advocacy, and dedication. I also will be supporting her amendment today because I think the provisions in that amendment will add even more positive changes to the command climate and will help victims feel like they have a stronger voice. However, while the changes in the McCaskill Amendment are very good, I do not believe that they are enough to truly ensure justice for victims of sexual assault. For that, we essentially need impartial, unbiased, objective consideration of the evidence by trained military prosecutors, which is what my amendment will provide. Yesterday, I proudly stood with retired generals, leaders of veterans organizations, and survivors who represent a growing chorus of military voices that are urging Congress to take its oversight role head on and finally create the independent, unbiased military justice system that the men and women who serve in our military so deeply deserve. Leaders like retired Major General Martha Rainville, the first woman in history of the National Guard to serve as an adjunct general, who has served in the military for 27 years, including 14 years in command positions. She wrote to me, quote, "As a former commander, endorsing a change that removes certain authority from the military commanders has been a tough decision. It was driven by my conviction that our men and women in uniform deserve to know without any doubt that they are valued and will be treated fairly with all due process should they report an offense and seek help or face being accused of an offense. When allegations of serious criminal misconduct have been made, the decision about whether to prosecute should be made by trained legal professionals. Fairness and justice require sound judgment based on evidence and fact, independent of pre-existing command relationships." Leaders like Brigadier General retired Lori Sutton, who served as the top psychiatrist in the U.S. Army. She wrote saying, quote, "Failure to achieve these reforms would be a further tragedy to an already sorrowful history of inattention and ineptitude concerning military sexual assault. In my view, achieving these essential reform measures must be considered as a national security imperative, demanding immediate action to prevent further damage to individual health and well-being, vertical and horizontal trust within units, military institutional reputation, operational mission readiness, and the civilian-military compact. Far from stripping commanders of accountability, as some detractors have suggested, these improvements will remove the inherent conflict of interest that clouds the perception and all too often the decision-making process under the current system. Implementing these reforms will actually support leaders to build and sustain unit cultures marked by respect, good order, and discipline. And Lieutenant General retired Claudia Kennedy, the first 3-star female general in the Army, wrote, quote, "Having served in leadership positions in the U.S. Army, I have concluded that if military leadership hasn't fixed this problem in my lifetime, it's not going to be fixed without change to the status quo. The imbalance of power and authority held by commanders in dealing with sexual assault must be corrected. There has to be independent oversight over what is happening in these cases. Simply put, we must remove the conflict of interest in the current system, the system in which commanders can sweep his own crime or the crime of a decorated soldier or a friend under the rug, protects the guilty and protects serial predators, and it harms military readiness. Until leadership is held accountable, this won't be corrected. To hold leadership accountable means there must be independence and transparency in the system. Permitting professionally trained prosecutors rather than commanding officers to decide whether to take sexual assault cases to trial is a measured first step towards such accountability. I have no doubt that command climate, unit cohesion, and readiness will be improved by these changes. And Brigadier General retired David McGinnis, who also served as a Pentagon appointee, wrote, "I fully support your efforts to stamp out sexual assault in the United States military and believe that there is nothing in the Military Justice Improvement Act that is inconsistent with the responsibility or authority of command. Protecting the victims of these abuses and restoring American values to our military culture is long overdue. It is because they love the military that they are making their voices heard, standing united behind brave survivors." And I'd like to tell some of those stories because it's their stories that inform this legislation. Kate Weber from Protect Our Defenders, who was awarded the 2013 Women Veteran of the Year by the California Department of Veteran Affairs, and Sarah Plummer, who came to Washington, D.C. all the way from Colorado yesterday to courageously tell their stories so that their brothers and sisters in uniform get a military justice system that is finally worthy of their great service to our nation. Sarah's story is extremely disturbing. She was raped as a young Marine in 2003. She said, "I knew the military was notorious for mishandling rape cases, so I didn't dare think anything good would come of reporting the rape." She said, "Having someone in your direct chain of command doesn't make any sense. It's like getting raped by your brother and having your dad decide the case." Kim Hanks, brave survivor from the infamous and horribly unjust Aviano case, who spoke months ago about this issue when our journey began. Kim just wrote an op-ed published this week, quote, "Regardless of all the promises by military leadership and half measures offered in the name of reform, nothing short of removing the prosecution and adjudication authority away from the commander and placing it with independent military professionals outside the accused and victims' chain of command will end this nightmare." Or Trina McDonald, who at 17 enlisted in the Navy. She was stationed in a remote base in Alaska. Within 2 months, she was attacked, repeatedly drugged and raped by superior officers over the course of 9 months. She said, quote, "At one point, my attackers threw me into the Bering Sea and left me for dead in the hopes that they would silence me forever. They made it clear that they would kill me if I ever spoke up or reported what had been done." Or listen to Army Sergeant Rebecca Havila, who served in Afghanistan, was raped in 2007, reported the crime to her commanding officer. To her, was unthinkable. Quote, "There was no way I was going to my commander. He made it clear he didn't like women." Or Airman First Class Jessica Himes, who was raped in 2009 by a coworker who broke into her room at 3 in the morning. She said, quote, "2 days before the court hearing, his commander called me on a conference call at the JAG office, and he said that he didn't believe the offender, quote, acted like a gentleman, but there wasn't a reason to prosecute." Quote, "I was speechless. Legal had been telling me this was going to go through court. We had the court day set for several months, and 2 days before, this commander stopped it. I later found out the commander had no legal education or background, and he'd only been in command for 4 days. Her rapist was given the award for Airman of the Quarter. She was transferred to another base." We also can't forget that more than half of the victims last year alone were men. Blake Stevens, now 29, joined the Army in 2001, just 7 months after graduating high school. The verbal and physical attacks started quickly, he says, and came from virtually every level of the chain of command. In one of the worst incidents, a group of men tackled him shoved a soda bottle into his rectum, threw him backward off an elevated platform onto the hood of a car. When he reported the incident, his drill sergeant told him, quote, "You are the problem. You're the reason this is happening." His commander refused to take action. Blake said, quote, "You just feel trapped. They basically tell you you're going to have to keep working with these people day after day, night after night. You don't have a choice." His assailants told him that once they deployed to Iraq, they were going to shoot him in the head. Quote, "They told me they were going to have sex with me all the time when we were there." Now, this is the problem. There were 26,000 sexual assaults estimated by the Department of Defense last year alone, based on confidential surveys. But only 3,374 were actually reported. Of those reported, 302 went to trial. So if you are starting with 26,000 estimated cases and only 302 go to trial, that is a 1% rate of conviction in the U.S. military for the heinous crime of degradation, aggression, and dominance of rape and sexual assault. 1%. And you just heard from these victims, there are too many command climates that are toxic, that do not ensure good order and discipline, that do not protect against rape and sexual assault, that do not create a sense that if I come forward and report that justice could be done. In this survey, this confidential survey, the reason victims didn't report is they said they didn't believe anything would be done. They also said they either feared or witnessed retaliation. This is the problem. About 23,000 cases weren't reported. It means in 23,000 command climates, these assaults are happening and victims feel they will not get justice. So I am grateful for every reform we've put in place in this underlying bill. They are good, strong reforms that will help victims who report, but every single one of them applies only to this 3,000 cases. They apply to the cases that are reported where the command climates are sufficient that a victim feels, I can come forward. I can at least report this case. In the 23,000 other cases, those victims don't have that confidence. And so, Madam President, if you don't create a transparent, accountable system that's outside the chain of command, your hope of getting more victims to come forward and report so we can at least weigh the evidence and see whether we can go to trial, it's not there. The hope isn't there. The confidence in an objective review by someone who doesn't know the perpetrator and doesn't know the victim doesn't exist. So while you have these 3,000 cases, that were reported, and commanders did make sure 1 in 10 went to trial, and when they did go to trial, you had a 95% conviction rate, so they're not making the wrong decisions about what case to try. It's just that only 3,000 of these command climates were strong enough. You can't train your way out of this problem. There's 23,000 command climates that weren't strong enough, that didn't ensure justice, that created fear of retaliation. That's the problem. And so without your objective system, without creating transparency and accountability, without saying the decider doesn't know the victim or the perpetrator, there's no bias. Because in too many cases, as you heard from these stories, the perpetrators may well be more valuable to the commander, may well have several tours of duty under his belt, may well have done great acts of bravery, may well have 2 kids and a wife at home. And so when that commander looking at the case file says, can't possibly have happened, didn't happen this way, he weighs the evidence differently than someone objective who's trained, who actually knows the difference in these crimes and knows what a rape is. They know that a rape is not a crime of romance. They know that a rape is a crime of dominance. They know that a rape is a crime of violence. It's not about a date gone badly. It's not about hormones. It's not about a hookup culture. It's actually a crime that is brutal and violent, committed by someone who is acting on aggression and dominance and violence. So that's why the training matters, Madam President. I want somebody who knows that, who's been trained as a lawyer, who understands prosecutorial discretion and can weigh evidence objectively. So we have to look at who's advocating for this bill. Our veterans organizations, Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, want this reform. Vietnam Veterans of America want this reform. Service Women's Action Network want this reform. They're all speaking in one voice. And they say, quote, "A vote for an independent and objective military justice system is a vote for our troops and a vote to strengthen our military." They know they've served. They're veterans. They're no longer active duty. They can speak their mind. This week, we released a letter of 26 retired generals, admirals, commanders, colonels, captains, and senior enlisted personnel, including 2 generals and 2 admirals known as flag officers, who are saying to Congress, quote, "We believe that the decision to prosecute serious crimes, including sexual assault, should be made by trained legal professionals who are outside the chain of command, but still within the military. This change will allow prosecutorial decisions to be made based on facts and evidence and not be derailed by pre-existing relationships, attitudes, biases, and perceptions. It is our sincere belief that this change in the military justice system will provide the opportunity for real progress toward eliminating the scourge of sexual assault in the military." I am hopeful, Madam President, that our colleagues will listen to these collective voices, because nobody knows the military and what needs to be done to fix this broken system than they do. Listen to the victims who have clearly told us over and over again how a system that only produces 302 prosecutions out of the DOD's estimated 26,000 cases of rape, sexual assault, and unwanted sexual contact last year must be fundamentally changed to restore trust and accountability. These men and women of America's military have put everything on the line to defend our country. Each time they are called to serve, they answer that call. But too often, these brave men and women find themselves in the fight of their lives, not on some far-off battlefield against an enemy, but right here within our own soil, within their own ranks, with their commanding officers, as victims of horrible acts of sexual violence. Sexual assault is not new, but it has been allowed to fester in the shadows for far too long, because instead of the zero-tolerance pledge we have heard for 2 full decades now, since Dick Cheney was the Secretary of Defense, using those words in 1992, what we truly have, Mr. President, is zero accountability. There's no accountability because the trust that any justice will be served has been irreparably broken under our current system, where commanders hold all the cards over whether a case moves forward or not to prosecution. Now, there are those that argue that removing these decisions out of the chain of command into the hands of independent prosecutors in the military will diminish good order and discipline. This is not a theoretical question. We actually know the answer to this. Our allies have already made these reforms, and they have not seen a diminishment in good order and discipline. The UK, Israel, Australia, Canada, Netherlands, Germany, all of them have taken the decision-making of whether or not to prosecute cases outside the chain of command for civil liberties reasons, some in instances of defendants' rights, some in instances of victims' rights, to make their justice system better. We could use a better justice system. We could use that transparency and accountability here. We have a unique problem. I think this reform solves our problem. The Director General of the Australian Defence Force Legal Service, Paul Cronin, said that Australia has faced the same set of arguments from military leaders in the past. Quote, It's a little bit like when we opened up to gays in the military in the 1980s, Cronin said. There was a lot of concern at the time that there'd be issues, but surprisingly, there haven't been any. There are those who argue that our reform our reform would somehow take commanders off the hook, or that they would no longer be accountable. Let me be clear. There is nothing in this bill that takes commanders off the hook. They are still the only ones responsible for setting command climate, for maintaining good order and discipline, for making sure these rapes and assaults don't happen, to making sure there's no retaliation if a victim comes forward, to make sure that the command climate is sufficient so when they do come forward. This is a legal decision. And actually, most commanders never get to make this legal decision. Your platoon sergeant, your drill sergeant, they're never going to be able to be the convening and disposition authority. That's not their job, but they still have to maintain good order and discipline. They're on the hook, and the underlying bill is strong because we make retaliation a crime to give them just one more tool to help them set their command climate. There are those who argue that this reform will cost too much. I do not know how you could possibly say that enforcing cases and prosecuting rape in the military cost too much. Our men and women in uniform are worth much more. Not only do these critics ignore the fact that we already have trained JAGs serving in our military, they actually ignore the financial cost of sexual assault in the military. The Rand Corporation has estimated that this scourge costs $3.6 billion last year alone. There are those who say commanders move forward on cases that civilian prosecutors won't. To claim that keeping prosecutions inside the chain of command will increase prosecutions is not supported by the statistics. Because if you only have 3,000 or so cases being reported and 23,000 cases not being reported under the current system, if you change that system and those 23,000 cases start becoming reported cases, you will have more prosecutions. You will have more convictions. You will have more justice. The bottom line is really simple. The current system oriented around the chain of command is producing horrible results and has been producing horrible results for 25 years. The current structure is producing 1% of cases that go to trial. That is not good enough. It is not a system that is deserving of the sacrifice that the men and women in uniform give to our country every single day. It's also contrary to the fundamental values of our American justice system. Our justice system relies on the fact that a decision about whether to go to trial is never made on bias. It is always made on facts and evidence. It's not made on whether it's good or not for the commander. It's made on whether or not there are facts and evidence to prove that a serious crime has been committed. For all those that say this is a radical idea and should just wait till next year, the DOD has an advisory panel that actually has opined for the past 50 years on the status of women in the military. That panel, called the Dakowitz, that panel had a vote on these proposals, and they voted in favor overwhelmingly with no one against. Of the 10 votes that we have, 9 are former military, 4 are high-ranking generals and officers. The non-military voice is the head of the Women's Law Center. Knowledgeable individuals who are actually tasked by the Department of Defense, handpicked by the Department of Defense, to opine on the status of women in the military, and they have voted to support these measures. Secretary Hagel has even said that he, quote, places a great premium on the voices of this panel. I've not come to the conclusion that we need to fundamentally reform our military justice system in order to strengthen it. But this is a common sense proposal. It's not a Democratic idea. It's not a Republican idea. It's just doing the right thing. And if you listen to these survivors, veterans, retired generals and commanders, they believe this change is needed. But even our current military commanders at the Department of Defense do not dispute the problem or the facts or the reason of the problem. Commandant of the Marine Corps, General James F. Amos, said in a speech earlier this year that victims don't report these cases because, quote, they don't trust us. They don't trust the chain of command. They don't trust the leadership. We have to restore that trust. And if you have too many commanders and too many command climates, the 23,000 unreported cases where that trust is broken, you're not going to fix it by keeping it with the commanders. That is the problem. This is the fundamental problem. Listen to Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, who has said that the military is sometimes, quote, too forgiving, end of quote, in these cases, admitting bias in the system towards decorated officers. Mr. President, I firmly believe it is our obligation to restore that trust. Our fundamental duty as senators, as members of Congress, to provide the needed oversight and accountability over the armed services. We should not do what the generals are telling us to do. This is our job. Every time I meet with a member of the military, I am overwhelmingly grateful for their service, for their sacrifice, for their courage. They deserve better. They deserve a military justice system that is consistent with our core, fundamental American values of objectivity, of truth, of evidence, of facts, and of justice. I urge my colleagues to support our amendment. I yield the floor.